John Boy.
Lessons from the screen, what we mean is we go through different documentaries to tell you what they gon' do. Give you our lessons, give them our blessings. If they trash, we tell you there is no second guessing. Knowledge is power, but time is precious. And we're here to keep you from them lessons. So sit back as we groove, giving you the review, so you only spend time on the docs that you need to. Welcome to Lessons from the Screen, the show where we give you a review of whether or not any particular information that you can get through any particular screen of any kind is worth your time. We waste our time, our energy, and our brain power so that you don't have to. Lessons from the Screen is sponsored by PaxInc, a black activist advocacy and think tank with the purpose of increasing the quality of life for black people in America through education, a culture shift, and economics. You can check them out at www.pactsinc.org. That's paxinc.org. And as always, as I always say, leave a review. Leave money, a donation, leave your time, volunteer, take a survey, whatever, word of mouth, get word out. Do whatever you need to do to support the organization, because the organization is doing what it needs to do to support you. Education is indoctrination, and it shouldn't be that way, because the difference between the terms is supposed to be imparting the ability to critically think about a subject matter, education, versus simply being told that something is true, indoctrination. Now, we can argue all day about which one we get, but that's not the point. In modern society, education is indoctrination. Even in societies where education is practiced correctly, and I got my rabbit ears up when I do that, there is a part of the education process that involves indoctrination, and that simply can't be separated from the education process. The passing on of culture and values, as well as the continuation of a society, requires that all members have certain levels of acceptance and agreeableness to the world they live in. Otherwise, everything breaks down. These are some of the philosophies we'll be talking about today. In 2010, Carol Black released her documentary, Schooling the World, with the focus on getting people to think about the impact of foreign education on indigenous peoples all over the world. In this episode of Lessons from the Screen, we will be looking at this documentary. What's in it? What's it about? And should you watch it? Of course. And obviously, this is all coming from our perspective. This show is all about schooling the world, the white man's last burden. Schooling the World is a call to action documentary that presents its case and then presents multiple ways for you to get involved. And with that being said, the case that it presents is one that strikes deep into Western culture. The case that our culture is right, we have the answers, your culture is broken and needs to become more like ours in order to be fixed. This documentary goes from culture to culture, people to people, all over the world and throughout multiple periods of history, looking at how Europeans have, through education, sought to reshape indigenous peoples into mirror images of Europeans, oftentimes completely disregarding the effect of such an education and the secondary effects of what it'll do to the societies and the cultures that the children come from. The film makes the case that a singular culture of consumerism is taking hold of the globe as people are preparing and dreaming of jobs that are scarce and for a lifestyle that is materialistic and unreasonable in the societies that those people come from. Languages are being destroyed, cultures and societies are losing their sustainability and heritage as well as their history and subsequently being destroyed, and the dream of Western society is destroying real happiness. The film makes some pretty big claims with regards to Western white culture, And the only documentary that I've seen that makes bigger claims than this one is the Independence Day Project by Professor Carlton Jones. And I reviewed that one a few months ago, and you should definitely check out that show as well as check out the Independence Day Project. That can be gotten from his website, www.blackindependence.com. And there is a link to that show and to that website on the Freedom Train Radio, www.freedomtrainradio.com. But this documentary went very strong and made some very direct and hardcore claims about European culture, European society, and Western indoctrination of indigenous peoples, as I said before, globally and throughout multiple time periods. So as you're watching this documentary, should you choose to do so, there are a lot of points to be pulled out of this documentary. I think one of the biggest takeaways, lessons, or observations for me was the need to educate your own children and to make sure that the fundamentals of that education are the tools needed to survive. You see, a lot of the times we completely overlook the fact that our children are not being educated by us. They're not being educated by people that think like us, by people that have had our shared experiences, by people that see the world the same way that we do. And we have to begin to understand that education is indoctrination. If you take two children from two of the same cultures, they have the exact same situation. If you could set this up in a study where everything is the same about how these children are brought up, except the curriculum that's used to educate them, you will have two completely different adults with two completely different world outlooks. Education is just that powerful. It informs people about how they should view the world, how they should view themselves in it. As such, it becomes the primary conduit for the transference of culture. It becomes the primary conduit for the transference of self-esteem, pride, heritage. All of these things are imparted through education. And so when we relinquish control of the singularly most powerful instrument of adult creation to other peoples, we are losing control of our ability to propagate our own culture, to continue our own culture, and to sustain our own communities. So education is huge. And not only that, but it is necessary and required. And there are things that need to be involved in the educational process that are missing because we are not educating our own children. See, one of the problems you have is when you don't educate your own children, oftentimes the components of education that you feel are necessary for survival are not involved in that education. And that's because the components that are necessary for survival are viewed from the lens of the person doing the education. And if they don't look like you, have your experiences, your worldview, or your culture, they're not going to have the same priorities in terms of what's necessary and what's not. So nowadays, we know that interacting with law enforcement, for example, is a necessary skill for our children to survive. However, the people creating the curriculums and doing the educations, that's not a priority for them because they don't have the same relationship with law enforcement that we have. Take it to another point, quality agriculture, being able to create, raise, grow quality food is something else that's necessary for us in our environment, because oftentimes many of our communities don't have access to, even in terms of proximity to, high quality food deserts in cities where there is no access to high quality food. In those environments where people do their grocery shopping at what would amount to convenience stores and secondhand retailers, there needs to be places where people can grow their own food. That knowledge needs to be imparted: how to have hanging gardens, how to have spot gardens, how to have indoor gardens, how to grow your own food, because we know that the quality of the food that you eat has a direct relationship to the quality of life that you live. And that's a skill that is not a priority for other culture groups, because they have quality food markets in their neighborhoods. They don't even have to get in their cars, and if they do have to get in their cars, they don't have to drive very far to get to them. Whereas in a lot of black communities, you might be in the car for 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes to get to a place that sells quality food. And that's if you have a car. And that's if you have the money to purchase those things or to get to those locations. So educating our own children is mandatory. And we could spend a whole show just talking on the necessities of educating our own children, but we're not. We're going to move on to the next point. So in addition to educating our own children, another lesson, another huge takeaway was the necessity of teaching your heritage, teaching your history. And this is something we've had numerous studies now. Started back in the 90s, really picked up steam in the 2000s, and really got going in the late 2000s, the early 2010s, showing that cultural pride is a key indicator for success and happiness. Your children being proud of who they are, where they come from, is directly related to them understanding the history of what they've been through and what they have accomplished. And that goes into self-esteem and all of that. And if an education system isn't passing on heritage, history, and pride, then the education system is creating children that are going to become adults that are going to not only be less useful to their culture and to their society, but also more apt, more likely to do things that are negative and destructive to their culture and society, more likely to side with outsiders, to side with invaders, to side with other people that can give them temporary means of feeling good about themselves, instead of saying, this is my culture, I am proud of it, and I'm not going to partake in anything that's going to be harmful to it for trinkets. And that can branch off into a bunch of different areas when we begin to talk about athletics, when we begin to talk about entertainment, when we begin to talk about various subjects. That has an impact there. People that have pride, and that pride, again, needs to be a part of the education process, because you have to understand cultural transference is happening whether you like it or not. Your kids are being inculcated with culture from every angle. They're going to school and they're getting the culture that the school is providing. And whatever benefits, whatever positives, whatever perspectives that the administrators and the teachers have in the curriculum, whatever bias are built into the curriculum, all of those things are being transferred into your child. So you can't be a black person in America and say, I don't talk to my kids about race because I don't feel like that's a conversation we need to have, and think that you're doing your child a service. That conversation is being imparted into them whether you have that conversation with them or not. And if you don't take steps to ensure that they get your side, the other side of the equation, they're going to grow up and they're going to look at you as if you're an alien, as if you're a relic of the past, as if you're somebody that doesn't know what's going on, as if your thought process is inferior, because that is the way they are going to be educated. So that was a huge lesson, and that was one of the things that the documentary did touch on a lot, was the fact that the heritage was lost, the history was lost, the children were going back to their communities after being educated, but not knowing how to do anything necessary for the survival or for the continuation of the cultures and the communities that they grew up in. And then in some cases, looking down on those people that were doing the work, that continued their society, that continued their communities. So not only do we need to educate our children, not only do we need to make sure that the fundamentals of education are the tools that they need to survive, but we also need to ensure that we're teaching our heritage and our history and instilling cultural pride into our children. And we need to maintain control over the education of our children at all costs. This was something that goes back to the earlier point that I made, and I didn't mention it then, but I'm mentioning it now. Maintain control over the education of your children at all costs. Education should not be so freely and blindly given over to other people. Even in the documentary, there was a white guy that made this point where he said, if another group of people came to me and told me that I'm going to educate your children, I tell them to get out of here. And that is because, as I said earlier, the education of your children is so important. It's so mandatory. You need to be involved in that process, as deeply involved as you can be. It is a shame and a travesty that PTA meetings, that parent-teacher conferences, that school board meetings go completely unattended by the community that they affect. Education is super critical for more than just learning how to read and write, for learning how to be an adult, for learning how to think, and for instilling confidence and pride in who you are and where you came from. Now, the final point of mention here is an interesting one. And it's something that I think we need to talk about a lot more. It's something that I've been talking about with my friends for years, but it is something that this documentary does bring up and it hits on. And that is, well-meaning white folks still cause plenty of damage, and they still pose danger. They still pose a threat. And we've gotten into this space where we're harping on the white folk that are racist, that participate willingly, gleefully in the system of white supremacy and support it wholeheartedly. And we focus on those people. And we think that all of the bad that's happening in our community in terms of race relations is because of those people. And we tend to think about white people that aren't racist, white people that don't subscribe to the belief that white is superior, white people that do genuinely believe in equality. We tend to think of them as allies. And we tend to support them and stand up for them. And what's missing is that a good chunk of the damage done in black communities was not done by evil-intentioned white people. Yeah, we can point to the examples of just the mass destruction, raw loss of life. And those examples are huge. Those examples are viable and they're important. But for each one of those examples, there was a well-meaning, well-intentioned white person that some way, shape, or form facilitated even more passive damage and damage over time, DOT, to the community. White folks that looked the other way. White folks that stood up but then backed down when they were challenged. Or in the case of education, white folks who created schools with the intention of creating a better life for these people, without understanding that they still had a God complex that they hadn't dealt with. They still had a cultural misunderstanding of what was going on, and they were looking at things through their perspective, as if to say, to me, if they become this, they will be better off for it, without looking at it from the perspective of the people that they're trying to help, and understanding that learning how to operate a computer does a child no good in a village where there are no computers. And that isn't to say you don't create space, you don't create electives and things of this nature where kids do have the opportunity to develop those skills. But that is to say that when you make those skills the center point of education, you undercut the civilization, the community, and the society that those children come from. You essentially destroy the foundational fabric of those societies. When you mandate that they learn to speak English because you understand from your perspective that most of the world understands some form of English, and that the only people that speak their language are in their village, then you undercut their cultural pride in their native language, and you begin to impart on them, whether you're intending to do it or not, that their language is inferior and English is the better language. And so in the way the conversation is going, we miss the point that it's not evil intentions. It's the lack of understanding that makes even well-meaning white folk a functional part of white supremacy. And so we get into these situations where we have white folk trying to tell us what we need to do to better ourselves, and they could be some of the best intentioned white people in the world, not taking nothing away from them. But it does not change the fact that their perspective is oftentimes not a perspective that is even going to see or understand what we're dealing with, and as such, their advice becomes essentially useless to us. It becomes more harmful than it is beneficial. And in Schooling the World, they show multiple examples of well-meaning white folk who are more harmful than beneficial. So overall, I'd give this one 4 stars. It is a must-watch. It really is a must-watch. However, with that being said, this was not a fair and balanced documentary at all. There were no voices from the other side of the argument presented whatsoever. And for many, this documentary will be viewed as a propaganda piece against modern education and European culture. And you can't really argue with them because there are no voices presented from the other side. And that means that you don't get to see the good, if there is any good, that is happening as a result of Western education. And the concept of the good isn't even presented. And the documentary the documentary makes the case that it is literally almost all bad. And despite the fact that I agree with the premise and the cases presented in the documentary, and I do agree with the overall tone and message of the documentary, we simply can't get away from the fact that it is deeply one-sided. And because of the one-sidedness, the one-sided nature of the documentary becomes a poor means of education as a standalone. So the documentary itself falls into the very trap that it does such a good job of illustrating Western education does. And that shows the bias of the white lady that made the documentary. However much I want to agree with the documentary, and I do agree with the documentary, it still doesn't dismiss the fact that the documentary does not present credible arguments from the other side that induce critical thinking. And as such, the documentary becomes a tool of propaganda and indoctrination. That being said, it is a call to action documentary, which means that the solutions to the problems are presented and are available. And that is a big positive point for me, because being a one-sided documentary, I was going to give it a 3. I agree with it, but it is one-sided. It does present powerful cases, but again, it's one-sided. So it's hard to give it anything more than a 3. However, the fact that it presents solutions, in my opinion, any documentary that presents solutions gets a point just for that. So because it presents solutions, it gets an additional point, which bumps it up to the 4 stars. So this has been another episode of Lessons from the Screen. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next week on the next episode.
Lessons from the screen, what we mean is we go through different documentaries to tell you what they gon' do. Give you our lessons, give them our blessings. If they trash, we tell you there is no second guessing. Knowledge is power, but time is precious, and we're here to keep you from them lessons. So sit back as we groove, giving you the review, so you only spend time on the docs that you need to.
Once again, I want to thank you for tuning in to Lessons from the Screen. Lessons from the Screen is brought to you by PAX Inc. through the Freedom Train Network. You can find us on www.freedomtrainradio.com or on iTunes, Google Play Music, or Stitcher. Be sure to head to one of those places and leave us a review, and then be sure to head back to the website to let us know what you think about the show and communicate with us. Also, be sure to head to www.paxinc.org and show some love and support for our sponsors. PAX Inc. is doing big things in the community and trying to do more, always trying to do more. So be sure to head to the website. That's www.pactsinc.org. Donate, volunteer, become a member, talk about it, whatever. They can use your support. And once again, they are doing great things in the community. And as always, Lessons from the Screen has a frame of reference and perspective that is aligned with that of the Black community. The things that we look at, whether it be on the Trending Tuesday or the regular Lessons from the Screen show, will always be looked at from the Black perspective. So keep that in mind, because we need more minds shaped into that perspective and trying to do things that we need done for ourselves. So with that in mind, again, thank you guys for listening in. Remember to tune in to the Freedom Train Radio. We have the app that's available that you can get from the website. It's in the Google Play Store. Sorry, it's not available on iTunes yet. We have the live internet radio, and we have more shows coming up. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I will see you guys on Thursday for the next episode of Lessons from the Screen.